Grateful to Scott to be here. For those of you that have not had the pleasure of knowing Scott before, I've known him for many years now. He is the president and senior fellow of the Technology Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., a very active and very well-regarded think tank. He was also economics director for the Federal Communications Commission's National Broadband Plan. I think that's around 2008, 2009, Scott. You served as an economist for the World Bank before that, as I recall, and served as a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, another think tank in Washington, D.C. So, Scott, thank you for being with us today. We greatly appreciate your lending us your time and your expertise to deal with an important issue. And so let's just jump right into that. I'm looking around at what people are saying, and a lot of people are talking about declaring broadband to be a public utility. And their argument seems to be it's just as essential as electricity, just as essential as water, so why not? But then I look and I say, well, food's really essential. Building houses is really essential. We don't declare those as public utilities. So I just wonder, being essential isn't sufficient then. What is it that would make it appropriate to declare any particular industry a public utility?
Well, thanks, Mark. First, thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of you and your work, so I'm really honored to be here. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk. Right, so this has been getting some attention lately. You hear more calls for broadband to be a public utility, and there seem to be two parts of that that make people think that would be appropriate. One is there is some group of people who think that a public utility means that it's publicly owned. And of course, we know that that's not necessarily true because they're privately owned and publicly owned utilities. And then we can, of course, get into a different discussion of public versus private ownership. And then the other is that somehow it would mean that it becomes available to everybody. And that somehow it would change the nature of the incentives to invest and provide service or something like that. The details usually aren't quite so laid out. It's usually said, let's make this a public utility so it's available to everybody. And then you might add in something about affordable rates. But the comparison between public services declared public utilities and broadband just don't pan out very well. And we've seen very fast expansion of broadband when it's not declared a public utility, faster than other things that are declared public utilities. And so, just on its face, it's not obvious that there would be that you would get any benefits from declaring it a public utility. And if you look back over time, you can see some significant disadvantages to declaring something a public utility. It would probably leave us all much worse off.
Okay, so in looking at electricity and water and telephone back in the old days, two of the things that seem to be involved in saying these are public utilities is that they were monopolies, and the government had said you're a monopoly and you have a certificate that designates you as a public utility. Is broadband fitting those two criteria these days?
Right. No, I don't think it does, and I'm not sure that telecommunications really ever fit that that designation. There was the assumption that it was a natural monopoly, right? That one firm could provide the service at the lowest cost, and we still seem to believe that about electricity, at least electricity distribution, not necessarily generation, and water. And we used to think that about telecommunications, about telephone service. It was never obvious that that was actually true for telephone service. We know that there, at least in the US at one point, there were lots of providers. There still are in very small providers. There are thousands of them around the country, not in any one given place. But it just doesn't, that argument doesn't really hold up anymore, if it ever did in telecommunications and broadband. And so to compare broadband to water or electricity, the comparisons just don't hold up.
So you wrote a paper on this issue: is telecommunications, should it be a broadband, should it be a public utility? And in drawing the implications, analyzing the implications of doing that, you looked at three things, comparing electricity, telecommunications. You looked at prices, you looked at innovation, and you looked at productivity. So let's start with the price issue. How did the prices compare? Public utility, electricity, non-public utility, broadband.
Right. So first, let's let's specify that measuring prices is always difficult because there are so many different margins that can be priced, and anybody who's studied telecommunications and broadband knows that's particularly difficult because people pay for different levels of service. Some things are bundled, some things aren't. So the comparisons they're hard to make, but the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, does lots of work to put together price indices. Everyone knows about the CPI, the basic measure of inflation in the United States, but they also do indices for lots and lots of industries. And the idea is to put together quality adjusted price indices to allow not just for these comparisons, but to see how prices have changed in different industries at different parts of the economy. These days during the pandemic, we hear more talk about that, whether different prices of foods and so on have changed relative to others. And as supply chains are disrupted or not, you can see those differences. And so it becomes particularly important that the BLS can do things like this. But if you look back, you could see that BLS has tracked prices for electricity and internet provision. And you could pick sort of any particular starting point going back. And we could see that if you, the series I started at 2006, and I can explain why 2006, electricity prices went up by about 25% since 2006. And internet prices from 2006 to 2019 were up a fraction of a percent, quality adjusted. So prices in electricity went up much faster than they did for internet. So the idea that somehow it would save people money, probably incorrect.
All right, and why might that be true? What is it about saying it's a public utility and regulating it as such might not give you such good price performance?
Right. So like you're hinting at, the key difference is the type of regulation that these services are under, and public utilities tend to be very heavily, at least relatively heavily regulated by the government. They have a say in how much the company can charge, what the company can invest in, and how the company has to invest. And over time, those can add up to big, to large effects. And very often, companies that are regulated end up charging more than companies that aren't regulated. Now, in part that of course stems back to the original reason that you said that if a company is given a guaranteed monopoly, you would want some kind of oversight over it. You don't want just a firm to be able to be a monopoly with no oversight at all. So if it was decided that these companies would be given a monopoly, then they become regulated, and then you have these prices. And if there's one firm, then there may not be a good option for how to regulate it. You need some kind of regulation and control. But over time, that ends up just being more costly and less efficient than an industry that faces competition.
Okay, so let's go to some of the other issues that you researched in your paper. So we just talked about price. What about innovation? Innovation is an issue you looked at. How does broadband compare with electricity?
Right. So innovation, of course, is another one that's hard to measure. And if you look at the history of research, research on innovation, we see lots of different things, lots of different measures that people try to use. Sometimes things like patents and research and development spending, and those are all useful indicators. But those also might be inputs instead of outputs. And so the National Science Foundation, which tracks all of these measures over time and across countries and across industries, has now been trying to find ways to look at output measures instead. And so they've been trying to measure new, what they call significantly improved products or services by industries. And they break it down by what they call telecommunications, and of course that includes internet service providers. It's the National North American Industrial Classification System, and that's NAICS 517. Sometimes you get into this argument when you say telecommunications that people think, oh, does that exclude broadband? No, it's just a classification. Those are the biggest companies in that group, and you can compare that to utilities, and both in terms of products and processes. These telecommunications firms in this industry group have introduced far more what they call significant innovations than have electricity. So again, you see it, and of course that's partly part of the explanation for why prices have increased or have not increased as much in internet as they have in electricity.
All right. So let me tell you one experience I had and get your response to it. Your answer to that question reminded me of it very early on in my career when I was a regulator. This would be in the mid-1980s, before some of the people in our audience were born, certainly before they began their careers. I was a telecommunications regulator, and telephone service was a monopoly at the time, and I was one of those pushing for doing away with that. Let's have competition. And one of the topics we talked about was innovation. And I argued innovation would be better because it'd be more customer directed. The telephone company representative, we were sitting in the room with the commissioners for the place that I worked, said, well, you know, that's not true, because any innovation that this commission in its wisdom would direct us to undertake, we would certainly undertake. So we would certainly be as innovative as we should be. What's your reaction to that? That, gee, the regulator or the government should know what the right innovations should be, and that the monopoly would undertake them. So what's the problem here?
Right. Well, you know, no single person or commission, really public or private, can possibly know what the right innovation is. You want innovation to be coming from lots of areas. And a key difference between, or a key difference should be between the public and private sector, is that if a regulator tells a firm it has to innovate in a certain way and the firm has to do what they say, then it probably will. Whether it's efficient or not, it's a different question. If a firm tries to, you know, innovates in one direction, it doesn't work, they'll stop and move in another direction. At least that's the way it should be. But you know, it is important to acknowledge the one part of it that is right, which was of course AT&T and the history of Bell Labs. And that's a little bit different. It wasn't the regulator telling them to innovate. It was that was the one kind of acknowledged benefit of a monopoly. They were able to take their monopoly profits and invest some of it in research, and they were able to because there wasn't really much concern of any other firm appropriating their innovations and doing things with it. And we still, you know, Bell Labs was an important part of U.S. innovation. And it's fair to say we haven't quite figured out a way to replace it yet. Although I think almost everybody would agree that what we've gained from competition far outweighs that loss. But I think it is important to acknowledge that that was the ability to appropriate all of the returns to your R&D investments was the one benefit that came from that.
Yeah, there's a recent book that came out talking about Bell Labs and why it was so innovative. And I can't remember the title. I'll look it up. I've been reading on it. I'll look it up, and we'll include it with the messages we send out after this, because it turns out that the culture and structure is really important. When AT&T formed Bell Labs, one of the issues it was dealing with was the warring factions between manufacturing and long distance. And they said, oh, we're just going to put all the bright innovators together, and they'll innovate for everyone, and had a very specific structure that kept the company's business needs from driving the innovation. The innovators were able to innovate on their own, while at the same time trying to take care of business needs. It really a fascinating book, but I'll get the title for people on that. So let's go to one more question. If people would, if you have questions for Scott, please put them in the chat, as I'm going to ask what is my last planned question at this point, but I've got lots more. But I'd like to turn it over to our audience. So Scott, we've talked about innovation, we've talked about price effects. Now tell us about productivity. What did you find when you looked at productivity issues?
Right. Well, there, productivity it has increased dramatically in whether it's wired telecommunications or wireless telecommunications. In fact, wireless telecommunications productivity has increased just radically because of it's newer. It started from such a it's come so far in such a short period of time. But productivity in electricity, again, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is much lower than it was more than a decade ago. It has not increased. And some of it, again, has to do with innovation. Innovation is such an important foundation of all of these changes, and it's why we worry so much about productivity statistics. It's why the question of slow productivity growth is the biggest economics puzzle right now that we need to figure out a way to resolve. And electricity, utilities in general are a contributor to this low productivity growth because they have not exhibited any growth in productivity. But part of it is innovation, like I said, but another part of it is the way that regulators and government is involved. In particular, it's very hard to improve labor productivity if you can't change the number of people who are working at the utility. And so the people who run the utility and even the regulators have the best of intentions to try to run the utility as efficiently as they can. If the government's not going to let them hire and fire to meet the needs, they're not going to see much labor productivity growth.
I was struck by a study or a paper written, this would have been, I don't remember, in the 1980s, probably someone Elizabeth Bailey.
Mm-hmm.
So Betsy was writing about productivity and how the deregulation of AT&T affected that. And the way she looked at it was how many people did AT&T fire once deregulation started. And it fired upper management. It tended to keep all of the technical workers, but got rid of upper management. That's where the excess employment was, which I found really, really interesting.
Yeah, fascinating.
All right, so well, I'm ready for questions from the group. If they don't have them yet, that's fine. I still got some more, but people, please chime in.
There is, I think, there's one other point that's important to
Sure.
that's important to make, which is at least in the U.S., rural broadband coverage has been a big issue, and so sometimes people say we need it to be declared a public utility to make coverage expand more rapidly, and this is based on the history of the Rural Electrification Act in the United States, which managed to get every farm electrified, and it's sort of almost it's legendary how they were able to do it, and they get that act gets a lot of praise, and it should. It was amazing to electrify the entire country like they did. But what people don't know is that broadband has been adopted and made available faster than electricity was, even in rural areas. Now, rural areas did get to 100% or pretty close to 100%, but it took it took several decades, and so we'd have to wait another 30 years to find out if broadband expanded as rapidly as electricity did. So it's not at all a criticism of the work that the government did to get America electrified, but again, in comparison sense, trying to go with that model would mean slowing down rural, building out broadband in rural America.
Yeah, I was struck by a paper done a long time ago. I've forgotten who the author was, looking at the growth of telecommunications in the US over about 100 years worth of time, and found that the most rapid escalations were when competition was allowed in the early part of the 20th century. It slowed down once we said AT&T could be a monopoly, and then picked up its growth again in kind of the era that you were talking about, when there was funding made available to start up rural telephone companies. So people kind of started their own. So it was actually a competition for the market. I didn't have competition in it, but certainly a competition for the market really spurred the development a lot.
Yeah, Absolutely.
So, Scott, a lot of our audience is from outside the US, and your study focused on the US, but you've done a lot of international studies as well. Tell us how you would compare what you analyzed in the US to what you know of countries in the rest of the world.
Right. Well, so first, I know the U.S. and I know many countries around the world. Worked in them, and most recently in Mexico and some other countries in Latin America. But institutional knowledge of this particular country and the regulations are incredibly important. So I don't want to pretend to be an expert on specific countries. And if I sound like if I start to sound like I'm being an expert on a particular country, you probably should ignore me, because it's just, you can't emphasize enough the importance of the institutions in a particular country and the specific knowledge that people who live there have. But one thing that's often the case is that competition, if competition itself isn't given enough of an emphasis, then various reforms don't work as well as they could or as they should. And often you can, if the prices are higher than they are elsewhere, along with service not being as good, you can dig down and find that there's there's something blocking entry. So it might be that the incumbent owns the landing rights to the submarine cables coming in, and everybody needs their permission to use them. That could be a huge barrier right there. Sometimes the regulator has decided that there should only be one company. That's less common, much less common now than it was up until the 80s, very early 90s maybe. But competition is usually what should be the focus. Okay.
All right. So we do have a question from Johannes Bauer, but I'm not sure I can do it justice. So Johannes, I'd like to put you off until after 10:30 so you can verbalize your question, because I don't think I'll be able to say all the things that are needed to be able to understand it well. So if that doesn't work for you, let us know.
From Johannes.
But yeah, we'll get to that after 10:30. So one of the things you alluded to earlier, Scott, was this issue of public versus private ownership, and you've done research on that area.
Mm-hmm.
How does that relate to the issue of public utility, and then what are the consequences of public versus private ownership?
Right. So competition is always the key underlying factor, and in principle, you can have publicly owned companies competing with privately owned companies. The problem is that typically when you have a publicly owned company, it ends up being also supported by subsidies, either explicit or implicit, and you end up with the private company trying to compete with a subsidized public company, and then things don't go very well. Now, of course, you can also have a private company competing with a subsidized private company, which also can lead to not great outcomes. But that's always the problem. The public company is subject to lots of pushes and pulls from issues other than ones that are economic, or even the ones that are sort of socially driven. They might be government driven, like wanting to have the company employ people, for example. Mm-hmm. And that pushes things in the wrong directions too. So the competition doesn't quite go right then. And so once the public sector is involved too strongly, it becomes unclear. It can become unclear what that company is supposed to be maximizing.
Yeah, and related, as I've seen several studies over the years, I love the headline. I think this was in The Economist a very long time ago, talking about whether or not the government should own telecommunications, and they compared it to whether or not the referee in a soccer match, football, to the rest of the world should be allowed to kick the ball, and that was the headline: should the referee kick the ball? And that's been borne out in studies. There was one by Lynn Waverman several years ago where he looked at network interconnection, how it was done, and found out if the government was a part owner, the government set up rules that discriminated against its competitors. And in some of the situations like you talked about, where the government has granted someone a monopoly on the international gateway, that power enables that person to be both, that entity to be both referee and player, and it discriminates against its rivals. So yeah, lots of things can create some issues there.
Right, and the incentives can go, the incentives for the people running these companies then can become completely wrong. And without the managers or the regulators or anybody trying to behave in any kind of bad way. If you're running one of these, if you're in charge of a publicly owned company and your goal is, the government says you have to do X, you're going to do whatever you can to do X. And that may not be exactly the same thing as providing the best service at the lowest price in a sustainable way.
All right, very good. So we have a really good question from Tiago. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. My apologies. I'll read this one. He says, I agree with you that the telecom market under competition has performed much better than the public utilities did. However, under the competition regime, we've seen a growing trend of internet service providers partnering to share one physical infrastructure, aiming to save sunk costs, and then differentiating themselves and competing in the service provision. Don't you see this kind of movement as a market answer to the question of whether telecom services, or at least the infrastructure layer, should work better in a monopolist regime?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one of the most controversial issues I think around the world. The question basically is, do you want to which is ultimately better for consumers? Is it retail competition over the same infrastructure, or is it facilities-based competition? And at least in the U.S., the evidence has been pretty clear that in terms of promoting long-term investment or medium-term investment, it's been infrastructure-based competition. Although most of the studies have borne that out. I will point out though that it's an easier answer. Historically, it was an easier answer in the U.S. because we started with telephone infrastructure and a cable infrastructure. Whereas in many other countries, they only had one wireline infrastructure to begin with. So it was a harder decision, because if you still want to promote facilities-based competition in the long run, which I think in every case you do, the benefits from that in a place where there was only one line are going to be a little further off than they are when there are two lines. So I admit it's a harder question in those places. It also depends. So the way Tiago asked the question is very interesting too, because there's a difference in whether the regulator is demanding that happen, or if the market says that should happen. and I don't know the details of your country, but when the regulator says that you have to share your infrastructure, then of course the price becomes regulated, and then you end up in a situation where the companies that want to use the infrastructure will say, oh, the price of the cost to the company that owns the infrastructure is much lower than they're saying. So you need to give us a price that reflects that, to make sure that they don't get any advantage. And they'll come up with all these cost studies to show how low that true cost really is. And then the owners of the infrastructure will say, no, you're forgetting about the fixed costs, and you're forgetting this. And they'll come up with a study saying, no, the cost for us to provide this is really high. So you have to give us a high price. And then the regulator has to figure out what's right. And no matter how smart the regulator is, no matter how well-intentioned, how are they going to know? They have to make a decision, and you end up with this constant lobbying over time that ultimately then has negative effects on investment and innovation and so on. But if it's a market solution, that's different, and we actually see that sort of thing everywhere. We know that wireless companies lease out their spectrum constantly. I don't think people generally know this, but in the United States, we have billions of megahertz pops of spectrum that are leased and sold in secondary markets every year. We know that companies work out roaming agreements with each other, for example. And sometimes they just willingly sell access to other retail providers on their infrastructure, and those are all market solutions. The difference, of course, is that nobody's telling them what the price should be, and so that's so that's a different kind of outcome.
Now that's a really, it starts getting a really complex analysis. One of the people in our audience now is David Sappington. He wrote a paper probably about 15 years ago now that showed that sometimes the people who are using the incumbent's infrastructure and the incumbent would actually collude to get a higher price, because then they don't have to compete so much in the retail market. So it's really hard to come up with a simple answer that's going to work in all situations. David does have a question, and this will be the last one I'll read, then I'll refer to Johannes we'll try and get his mic opened up so he can ask his question. So David asked this. He says, during the pandemic, some broadband companies made Wi-Fi available at low or no cost. They also declined to terminate broadband service to customers that did not pay for their monthly bill. During the pandemic, some broadband companies, that's a repeat. How can you explain this behavior? Might it possibly be related to the desire to forestall regulation?
Yeah, that's a good question, and sure, that's got to be. I'm sure that's part of it. But part of it's probably for good. It's good public relations, and I think partly. I mean, maybe that's a cynical way of trying to say that they're trying to be good citizens for the moment. Yeah, there has been a push to try to either have companies forgive non-payments, or to have the government pay for everyone's broadband. All kinds of different rules, and ones, by the way, that wouldn't necessarily harm any of these ISPs. They may or may not be bad policy, but they weren't necessarily bad for ISPs. But it is possible that some were worried that this would open the door to more regulation, direct regulation, price regulation in the long run, and and that this would help forestall it. I think it is. Now I'm guessing, but I think it was important that they wanted to show that not having particular kinds of regulation didn't mean that people would suffer during a particularly bad time. I also think it's really hard to. We don't yet know how to interpret lots of things that are happening during the pandemic. So much of it is unexpected, and I think both governments and the private sector are trying to figure out, what are the right responses, and everyone is kind of flailing around trying to figure out what works.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Scott. So, Sam, I'm going to turn things over to you. I skipped over Johannes's question. I think he'll do better justice to it asking it directly.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks, Mark. I mean, you got me to chuckle actually. I thought maybe this is one of my questions again that I don't even understand myself. So give me a little chance to sort of reflect on it. And I want to preface it by saying I agree with much of what you said, if not with all of what you said, Scott. But I'm wondering whether you sort of use the very sort of US-centric notion of public utility, which there were historically broader discussions, but eventually I think it was strongly associated with the notion of regulated monopoly. And but I think some of the current discussion, why people go back to this notion of public utility, goes back to a broader, older, and maybe definition that is used in other countries too sometimes, of a public service, in the sense that a service that has very, very strong public good characteristics, right? It's sort of in the public interest, and a service in which sort of private competitive forces don't align the private and the public interest well. And the question is, how do we align that broader public interest? For example, broadband as a service that is essential for education services. I mean, only 44% of our K-12 schools were able to effectively teach online, in response to COVID-19. So this is a huge public cost, right? And so maybe the concern here is, how do we align those broader public benefits with the actions of private providers? And so ironically, right, one of the reasons why there's a sense they're not well aligned is probably regulatory and policy failure, that they have struggled to really sort of serve those 20% of people. And I find it kind of ironic, right, that we go back to regulation as a fix for something that might actually be considered as a failure of really aligning those public and private benefits. I'm not sure if this is any clearer, but sort of that broader sense of public utility, is that in play? And what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, thanks, Johannes. So if you agreed with most of what I said, then I'd consider that a win. But the question is, it's a good one. What if there's, I guess maybe you're kind of saying there are some kind of public good externalities from particular kinds of service, and maybe even private benefits that some people can't afford, or we have sort of larger societal goals in this. And I agree with that point. But I don't believe that things that we've done to declare services public utilities work towards achieving those goals. So the first is, of course, there's an underlying cost structure to providing service, and that is what it is, and it's not affected by what I think the right governance is, or anybody. Just there's a cost, and that can be affected by innovation and so on. And so we have to find ways of providing. There are a couple things. One is we have to provide ways of providing service where it can't be sustainable, where they can't make enough money to earn back that service. To earn back the cost of providing that service. And then the other is people who can't afford it, but we still think that for various reasons they should have it. You mentioned the problem with distance learning in the pandemic. And first, let me talk about that. We're sort of getting some evidence now that that's just been kind of a disaster, and anybody who's a parent knows that when they see their kids not doing their schoolwork all day long, and the teachers trying their best but not knowing how to do it. That's a separate issue. And then also, then there's the income-based digital divide, that many poor kids don't have proper access to these services. But the way that we deal with that, or the way we try to deal with that, is through other kinds of programs, like our universal service programs. And those have other issues. And with those, there are two things. One is, to the extent that they haven't succeeded, it's often because of political reasons. So in the United States, and I'm sure these political influences are similar elsewhere, rural areas have a very strong, have a lot of power in the Senate, in particular in the US. And much of our rural support for rural broadband ends up going to goes to existing telephone companies. There are thousands of them throughout the rural US that exist only to get these universal service funds, because they're much too small to have any economic justification. And so essentially, we've spent over $5 billion every year already trying to build out broadband or support broadband in rural areas, and it's still not that great. And we've spent up till now, since our universal service program started, in real dollars, something between 80 and $100 billion on this, and we still have all these problems. It's a problem also with the debate. Every time people say we have to spend more in rural areas, they forget that we've already spent this much, and don't ask, why has it not succeeded yet? And because the people who say that rural broadband has problems and it's bad are correct, and we need to know why these programs aren't really working in solving the problems. Declaring something a public utility is not going to change the underlying incentives of how this money is being spent, and how to pay for how to subsidize build out in those areas. Now, the FCC can only do so much. Congress tells them, has to tell them what to do, but on the margins, they've been introducing things like reverse auctions, which were first done in other countries. I think I wrote about this one. I think like Peru was probably, they've been the very, very first to do reverse auctions, subsidy competitions for subsidies. And it's still, in the US, it's a tiny fraction of what we're spending that they're doing this way, but it's a big step to be able to do it. The second is with the income-based digital divide, which is bigger than the rural digital divide. It's a much bigger problem. That gets less attention here because poor people have much less influence than do rural areas. But that divide has also persisted. And partly the reason is that we really don't know why the last group of poor people, of low-income people, don't go online. When in surveys, stated preference surveys, they tend to say two things. They say it's the cost, and then they say they don't need it of the group that isn't online. Now, but it turns out that in practice, the cost doesn't seem to be the main reason. The FCC did 14 experiments in 2013. It was really amazing. They did a really nice job with these experiments to try to see what could encourage low-income people to go online. They worked with these were each with different companies, each of these experiments. They had different price plans. They offered digital literacy in some. They were wireless, they were wireline. They tried to work along all different margins to see what would get people to subscribe. One of the plans available was as low as $2 a month. And what they found was they couldn't get people to subscribe. They got about 10% of the subscriptions that they thought they would under the plan. And so the main thing that they learned was that we don't know what causes why people don't subscribe at the end of the day. And we should be doing a lot more work to figure that out if we're serious about meeting what we think are important social objectives. It pains me that people don't seem to be serious about finding this out. Right now, during the pandemic, you mentioned the schools and distance learning, school systems and communities and ISPs are doing all kinds of things to try to mitigate this digital divide. I think it was David who mentioned that some ISPs were making Wi-Fi service available for free. Schools are handing out hotspots and Chromebooks, and they're all doing it differently. So what we have right now are thousands of experiments going on around the country in how we might do this. Nobody seems interested in tracking that. Nobody's taking down this information to see what schools have done, and in order to follow up later to see what might have worked. So there's a lot of talk about getting people online, and I see no interest in anybody actually learning about what works. And frankly, I find it really upsetting. This is one thing. It's hard to say that anything about this has a silver lining because everything is so terrible. But we could have learned something, and nobody seems to want to.
That's an interesting observation, Scott. As I've talked with some of our colleagues around the world, they are going through just as many attempts to adapt and just as many experiments as we're seeing in the US. There is a strong interest in trying to figure out what have we learned, what do we hang on to, that hey, this worked and it's going to work afterwards as well. And we learned that these things don't work. So as you, maybe this isn't the best moment for the discussion, but we really should talk about how do we gather all that data and synthesize those lessons and get people to process them. It is critical. You're exactly right.
Right.
We did talk about the paper you wrote recently with Greg Roston from Stanford.
Right.
On what you just talked about. We talked about that with a young woman from Cox. She's a vice president for their public affairs, and then a gentleman who had been with Cable and Wireless. Now he's a consultant in Canada. About a week ago, we had them on Next Practices Live. They were of the opinion that is no longer an issue, that with the pandemic, broadband's value proposition has been now fully demonstrated and everybody will want it. Without having data to know for sure, what's your thought on that?
Well, I guess the key point is we don't have the data to know yet. But what it does seem like we're seeing that there's a spike in demand. And I don't just mean in people who have it already spending more time watching Netflix or needing it to work from home, but people who have a demand that they didn't think they needed before, school being one of them. And in fact, entertainment being another. That's the main reason why people sign up. And so I guess part of the answer to the question is the answer to another question, which is that some people believe that people who said that they didn't need it just didn't know what they were missing. And if that is true, and then they had, and then those people now had increased demands such that it caused them to subscribe or use broadband in one way or another. If it's true that they didn't know what they're missing, now they know, and they'll stay connected, and we'll see a big jump. And it's certainly possible. We don't know yet. We'll see.
So Judith Hellerstein has said that NDIA and the Internet Society are trying to look at these issues. So maybe we can have a conference call with them sometime and see how this could all be analyzed. Sam, you said you have someone sent you a question that they prefer that you ask rather than they ask themselves.
Sure. Yeah. So, Scott, I had a participant ask about if you could provide the reference for the FCC research that you mentioned. I think it says that it's about the internet adoption, and if you could share that with us.
Yeah, I wrote a paper on that. I'll send you the paper along with the FCC's summary of the experiments. Can I send it just to you, Sam?
Yes, absolutely. That will work perfectly. Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just make a quick announcement here. So this is a time now that we would love to hear from our participants, and just, any experiences that you're currently going through, or any, additional questions that you may have. And we kind of open up the mic and the video so you can directly talk back and forth with Dr. Jameson or Dr. Wallsten. So in order to do that, if you're using a laptop or a desktop, you would go to the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, and in the participant tab, there's an option that you can select a hand raising icon. And just click on that, and it'll prompt me that you've raised your hand, and then I will open up your audio, and you're free to share your video. If you're using a phone or a tablet, that Zoom toolbar will be at the top of your screen. Same thing, you just follow the participant tab, select the hand icon, and then I will unmute your audio, and you're free to share your video.
So Sydney's been offering a lot of comments in the chat. Could we see if Sydney would be willing to come on camera and share his thoughts?
Sure. Give me just one moment. Sydney?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
All
Feel
right,
free
thank
to
you.
share your video if you'd like, but you're ready to go.
Yeah, my video is not operable, and the background is not the best at this moment in time. I'm sorry for that. Yeah, I had two comments. The first one was regarding the infrastructure, and we're looking from a regulatory perspective. We're looking at the one infrastructure type model and infrastructure sharing, as this would minimize the overall cost for the operators to do business, and then they can carry on that savings to the customer, where access to services can become cheaper. And doing so, and more concentrate on the service, the type of service that they're delivering, rather than how it's being delivered, because that takes up a lot of their time. And it's a slow process to let the operators understand that, listen, it's not about lowering down your bar in terms of your quote unquote competition, but seeing that you guys have ultimately the same goal in delivering service to your customers, and for you to bear the cost, especially around these times, to bear the cost to put in infrastructure, and then and that cost, adding up at the end of the day, where you have to transfer that cost to your customer, and then your services become expensive, right? So slowly but surely they're understanding that, and we as the regulators are promoting that fact as well. It's a sort of a Singapore model type situation. As it relates to licensing, here in St. Martin, we have a concession type license, where it is certain services are mandatory based on the concession. Sadly enough, our legislation hasn't caught up with the times, where broadband is considered a utility, whereby we can include that into the concession requirements. But that is slowly coming around too, and I think with the advent of the coronavirus, and everybody staying at home and making more use of the broadband services, there's a real opportunity to adjust those requirements, whereby now it's going to become a mainstay. So yeah, from my side, that's what's happening here with us, and I like the presentation. It's very timely. Keep up the good work, Spur.
Well, thank you, Sydney. So Scott, he gets to an issue that he and I and a lot of my colleagues around the world have tried to get our heads around. And that is, especially if you're in a small economy where you're only going to get one right of way, one cable running from one place to another, or one tower. How do you know when to draw the line and say this is shared, this is not shared?
So I think what the implication is, what you're implying is that at some scale, these services are a natural monopoly. And I'm not sure I believe that to be the case. You know, it's not as if in very small communities here we'll necessarily only see one provider. So I'm not sure that I buy the, premise. But of course, like I said before, I don't know the institutional details of this country, so I'm not going to say that that's not possible. But I think it's important to recognize that really what Sydney's saying is that, I'm sorry to put words in his mouth, that's not what I mean to do, but for that to be right, it has to be the case that that it's a natural monopoly, right? And I would be hesitant to ever accept that that premise, because it will be very self-serving for the company, and they will certainly push that that premise because it's, well, it's good to be the monopoly, but to be the monopolist. So I'd be careful about that, and it also it worries me a little bit to hear someone say that the companies should have the same infrastructure because they have the same goal. We don't let companies here work together because they have the same goal. That's, you know, can lead to some pretty bad outcomes. Now I recognize we're talking about things that they're competing on the same in the same infrastructure. So presumably these retail providers would still be competing and could even offer differentiated services and so on. So it's not quite the same thing. But you know, the trade-off, if you believe, well, the trade-off will always be, do you want to get the most out of the infrastructure you have right now, or do you want to create more of an incentive to continue investing? And if there were no tomorrow, we would want everyone to share their infrastructure as much as possible, because it just wouldn't matter how much gets invested. So, you know, it depends on how much you weigh the different, how much weight you put on these different factors, and whether you believe that in a specific context, the service really is a natural monopoly.
All right, thank you. Sam, does anyone raise their hand?
Yes, so it looks like we have a hand raised. That's Sydney's hand, so I'm going to go ahead and, Sydney, I'm unmuting you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to comment on what Scott just said about the goals of the companies in terms of they're not aligned, but they may not be, it may not have the same road to their goal, but the goal is ultimately the same, is to provide service to a customer. And yes, the services might differ, but the infrastructure is basically the same. I'll give an example. Our island is 37 square miles big. It's actually divided in two. There's a French side and the Dutch side, and I'm on the Dutch side, and the Dutch side is only 16 square miles. So we're about as big as most probably Disneyland in Florida, you know, or maybe even smaller than Disneyland. And we have two major telecoms companies on the island, right? And for them to put in, both of them to put in fiber in the ground, right, going exactly the same direction, makes absolutely no sense to them. They're doing it because it's a competition type thing, but environmentally and cost effective wise, it makes no sense from a perspective of with that fiber, with that your investments, you're going to reach only 50% of the customers because there's only two operators on the island. So at the end of the day, your customers will suffer from it at some point in time because you have to pass that cost on to them at different points, whereby the customer just wants a service. They really don't care if it's fiber, copper, or wireless. They really don't care. They just want that service. So, and in that respect, I think the operators should be informed and as well, along with the regulator, and says, well, you listen, we understand, you want to do your own thing, but let's look at your operations, your infrastructures from a critical point and say, well, where are there points where you guys are the same, and those points you can share, whether it be a tower, whether it be a fiber, you name it, where it best suits you guys. And if it's one company that already has fiber in one part of the neighborhood, why does the other one have to do it? They can just share the infrastructure, and the money is actually on the service and not actually on the infrastructure. Thank you.
So what's keeping them from doing that now? I mean, like we talked about earlier, there's a difference between whether a regulator tells companies that they have to share or whether they just decide to do it. If it makes so much economic sense, why are they not doing that already? Is there a rule that says that they have to each lay fiber? I mean, this is an actual question. I'm wondering.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Absalom. Well, as it relates, we're not at this point in time. We're not forcing them to do anything. Again, it's purely what I've seen is purely on a competitive level. So they're doing it not because it's economically sound per se. They're doing it because their competitor is doing it, and their competitor doesn't want to sit on the table with them, and then that speaks from both sides. So that refereeing needs to be done by us, the regulator, but it's very difficult sometimes to get them to the table unless it's a situation arises. Like for instance, right now with the COVID, the demand for broadband is very high, right? And investments at this point in time, nobody's going to make a major investment because they don't know what tomorrow holds. So now they are coming to the table from the premise of, okay, we're in a position now we cannot invest, or we cannot invest heavily in our infrastructure. So yeah, that thought you had a couple of months ago, a couple of years ago about infrastructure sharing, we like to look at it now. Somebody once said, never miss missed opportunity in a disaster, and this is one of them, where we are looking at, okay, here's an opportunity now. They're coming to the table because of a need and not necessarily a want, but nonetheless they're coming to the table. So we're having that conversation as we speak. But we have been preaching this for many years, whereby we looked at the Singapore model, which is widely used and adopted in one form or the other in different parts of the world. We looked at it, and a lot of it doesn't really fit our needs and wants as a regulator and for our telecoms industry. But a lot of the others, I mean, what was used or what was premised to use did fit our needs and wants here on the island. But just the operators didn't want to comply with it because they said, well, yeah, if there's again, we are prone to hurricanes every year. And they said, yeah, if infrastructure gets destroyed, then both of us are out. And I said to them, well, that is true. But if you have different infrastructures and one gets out, one infrastructure is destroyed, so one company cannot operate, guess what? Your competitor is not going to look back at you. They're going to go full stream ahead and grab your customers, right? So you're still at a disposition. But if you pull resources together, that you guys together can fix the infrastructure at a faster pace and share the cost of it in the event of a disaster, then it makes good business sense. And again, things like this, they're agreeing with, but only from a premise of a disaster situation, not from a regular business sense like that.
So this is strange to me. So you have a situation where industry wants to invest in two separate infrastructures, and the regulator doesn't want them to. No. We want them to invest. I mean, we're not stopping from investing in infrastructure, but what we're saying is that when they do invest in the infrastructure, right? We told them, bear in mind that, of course, you're going to pass that cost on to the customer, and it's going to be becoming more expensive when it shouldn't be. But if you share again, we're only 16 square miles of an island,
And we have, at this point in time, believe it or not, we have 4 fiber networks running to the same place, the same neighborhoods by different companies. So we have the cable company has a fiber infrastructure, the 2 telecoms has a fiber infrastructure, the utilities company has a fiber infrastructure going to exactly the same direction and to the same customers.
So
and it's the customer who's going to choose which is which.
I would be very surprised if reducing the infrastructure competition led to reductions in costs to consumers. It's usually the competition that does that more than the underlying costs themselves. I also don't understand the disaster example. You said if there are 2 fibers and one gets destroyed, then the one company is going to lose its customers to the other company. But somehow that's worse than if there's only 1 fiber and it gets destroyed and everybody loses their internet. But not
necessarily worse. But what I'm saying is that the resources. So again, if there's a disaster, indeed, if there's only one infrastructure, that the 2 companies can pull the resources together and fix that fiber faster. In terms of they have, again, when I say 1 fiber, maybe I misspoke to a certain extent. The fiber itself in different neighborhoods, right? Again, they're different networks going to the same place, right? But in our plan as a regulator, we said, okay, well, if there's 1 fiber or 2 fiber networks going to the same place, right? You don't necessarily need a 3rd one, because those 2, it's better be served if you guys just share the costs for the maintenance and so forth with it, and everybody hops onto it like that. And then if there's only 1, and the cost to add another one is too high, or it doesn't really make much business sense, you can still share it. But again, it from a perspective of a disaster perspective, in terms of resources, it has been proven time and time again on other levels, whereby sharing infrastructure in a disaster event, that the resources are pooled and that infrastructure is fixed faster than if it was just 1 owner. And the owner says, well, you know what, that neighborhood, I don't have much customers there. I can wait a while and fix something else that is more important.
So the history of regulators getting involved in that kind of business decisions is not.
Well, it's not a business decision.
It is a business decision. You're telling them exactly how to invest. I think Australia did something similar, and it was a disaster. In the U.S. at least, and in other places, there are disaster plans with electricity. Actually, it's a good example for electricity. Crews from one utility send crews to help other utilities in other states. Even if they're not related companies. I don't know the details of that institution, how that works, but they definitely do combine resources. You're certainly right about that. Combining resources to assist in a disaster.
Yeah, but we not.
Yeah,
sure.
Our time is up.
Okay, no problem.
I think we'll try to have a session just on this particular topic, because it's not just you. There's several people who have been interested in it. So we will.
It's a great question, Sydney. It's a great argument.
Yeah. It's a critical argument for a lot of the small islands, especially, because I hear this all the time, and they've got a big struggle to try and work through. So Scott and everybody else, thank you so much for your participation today. This has been a great discussion. I'm glad that you found it so valuable that you gave us your time and gave us your energy and your questions.